Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's live stream program with Dr. Courtney Terry. Here Now We Stand, Black History Month conversation. This is the first of three programs that we have scheduled for Black History Month. And I want to talk a little bit about those in just a second. By the way, my name is Bob Abbey. I'm an adult services librarian for the city of Forest Grove. And we're really pleased to have you join us tonight, either on YouTube or on our Facebook channel. I mentioned a couple of upcoming programs, and I want to just share those with you as well. So on Thursday, February 16th, we have the team from Portland-based Black Futures Farm. It's Malcolm Hoover, Daniel Grady, Keone Young, and Nia Harris. And they'll join us for a program exploring Black foodways and ways of building community for Black liberation. Malcolm, Daniel, Keone, and Nia will also talk about their work, about the Black food justice movement, and their practices of cultural food production and farming techniques. And that's on Thursday, February 16th at 6:30. And then the third program we have for Black History Month is on Wednesday, February 22nd. We're kind of moving around the week here. We're switching it up from our usual Tuesday evening programs. On the 22nd, writer and historian Elizabeth McLaughlin will talk about the recently revised and updated edition of her 1980 book, A Peculiar Paradise, History of Blacks in Oregon, 1788 to 1940. This new edition was published by OSU Press and produced in partnership with Oregon Black Pioneers. This book is really one of the most significant histories of the African American experience in the West, and for the most part, the only extensive history of Blacks in Oregon. And now, 43 years later, it has finally received a second edition. So Elizabeth will be here to talk with us about that as well. As always, a reminder, these programs are archived on our YouTube channel, and you can also watch them on Facebook. So if for some reason you have to leave early, or you can't make a program, or you know someone who might like to watch these but can't be here with us when we air live, you can always check them out on the library's YouTube channel. And while you're there, hit the subscribe and the notification button, and you'll find out about all of our great content going up on YouTube. I'm coming to you tonight from Hillsboro, Oregon, and I work in Forest Grove. Both of those locations are situated on the colonized lands of the Atfalati Kalapuyans, who were also known as the Tualatin Band of Kalapuyans, and they were the first inhabitants of Washington County. Today, their descendants are members of the Grand Ronde and Siletz tribes, and they uphold the traditions and cultures of their ancestors. And I hope you'll join me in acknowledging and expressing gratitude for the ancestors of this place, and recognizing that we are here today because of the sacrifices that were forced upon them. As part of honoring that legacy, their lives, and their continuation in our communities, I encourage you to spend time and learn more about the rich history of Indigenous peoples locally, regionally, and nationally. So our presenter tonight, Dr. Courtney Terry, has been an associate professor in Black Studies at Portland State University since 2021. A native of California, Dr. Terry grew up in South Central Los Angeles and graduated from Humboldt State University in 2009 with a BA in Ethnic Studies. She then went on to pursue graduate work at Clark Atlanta University, which is the first historically Black college or university in the Southern United States. Dr. Terry earned a master's in African American Studies and a doctorate in humanities, and she specialized in English literature and African American studies. And her research now includes contemporary rap music and hip hop culture as it manifests itself in North America and the diaspora. And she is also currently teaching a class at Portland State, which she may talk about this evening. So I'm going to bring Dr. Terry into the stream. Hi, Courtney. Good evening.
Good evening, Bob. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that lovely introduction and land acknowledgement. Happy Black History Month.
Happy Black History Month. You're very welcome, and we're very pleased to have you with us tonight. As I mentioned to you, and as our viewers know, I'm going to get out of the way and turn things over to you. So we'll see you at the end of the presentation. And please, if you have questions or comments, add them in the chat box, put them in the comment section. We'll get to them at the end. This is an interactive program, so we want you to be part of this conversation as well. So please do that. And Courtney, we'll see you at the end of the show.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bob. And like Bob said, originally first let me give a thank you to the Forest Grove library staff and adult contemporary literature librarians for having me out, reaching out to me and coordinating this event for Black History Month 2023. I'm very, very thankful for that. And as Bob said, yes, originally from Southern California, did undergrad in Northern California at Humboldt State University, now Humboldt Polytechnic, for those of us who are keeping abreast of that. And yes, earned the master's and doctoral degree at Clark Atlanta University, which isn't the first HBCU, but it is the first HBCU to grant graduate degrees to folks who look like me. So yes, that is a fact. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And so, yes, we're here today to talk about or to discuss Black History Month then, now, and how it is expressed here in Oregon. And again, very thankful to be here with you all. So let me start out by sharing my screen. I have a few slides for you all, not too many, so bear with me. I'm going to share my screen here and get started. Okay. Share. Okay, it's bringing me up all of these things. We're going to go to view. And we're going to go to slideshow. All right. So the enterprise of Black History Month then, now, and expressed in Oregon. And also here now we stand at last. Right. Welcome to you all. Thanks to you all for congregating this evening on Zoom, live streaming, Facebook, YouTube. Totally appreciate you taking time out of your evening with us. And let's get to an overview. Just a few points we're going to be covering this evening. What is the enterprise of Black History Month? Early foundations of Black History Month in Oregon prior to 1926. The Oregonian enterprise of Black history from 1926 to 1948. From 1948 to 1972. And from 1972 to the present. I do believe in citations. This is a library, so I believe you all do as well. And so I'll be sharing a few of my sources that I leaned on and used to have this talk with you all today. All right. So I'm a very animated person, so please don't mistake my drama for lack of information, but you're in it now with me. So let's first talk about this title, right? I know some of us saw the title and it may have stirred up something in us when we saw the flyer. I said, oh, that's connoting on a lot of our historical documents in the US and even the language, right? And so I want to let you know that I signified on that line from the actual line from the African American anthem, right? Lift Every Voice and Sing, written by James Weldon Johnson, an alum of Atlanta University. So feel very close to him in that way. And so The title, Here Now We Stand at Last, again, it's signifying on the Black national anthem, which says, in part, right, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast, right? And so just sitting with that for a moment, understanding that in this national anthem for Black folks, right, that was adopted by Black folks, having this understanding of until we get stability, right, till now we stand. Until we get stability, we won't be able to make our dreams come to fruition, right? This is part of being reared in this land, having helped build this land, and seeking the full rights of citizenship in this land, right? So I signified on that for a reason. And also about, our location here in the Pacific Northwest, right? What does it mean to take a stand in a place so far away from the American ancestral home of many Black folks, right? Not to say all Black folks, but many Black folks. Absolutely. What does it mean to build a home here? Again, so far in proximity from those foundations, right? So I wanted to have us meditate with that. And I'll, at the end of this presentation, put a link to the Black National Anthem, all 3 verses in the chat here, so we can share alike, right? All right. So who founded Black History Month? Why are we even in this situation together today, right? And so we give honor to Dr. Carter G. Woodson, right? Whose brainchild it was, in part, right? Definitely he worked with some other brilliant Black folks and educators to help this moment come to fruition. So let's talk a little bit about Carter G. Woodson. So Carter G. Woodson was born about 10 years after the Civil War ended. Carter G. Woodson was born in 1875 in New Canton, Buckingham County, Virginia. His father, an escaped, I like to use the term self-emancipated, because escaped suggests that there was some accommodation made in the place of escape, right? But self-emancipated suggests that there was some emancipation that needed to happen, right? So again, Carter G. Woodson's father, self-emancipated man named James Henry Woodson, grew up, reared on a plantation near the James River in Richmond, Virginia. Very popular place as far as seafood contemporarily, right? James Woodson escaped after a conflict with his owner, right? So that connotes this day-to-day lived experience of the morally monstrous, physically unsafe nature of the institution of enslavement here, right? Carter G. Woodson's father joined the Union Army. The Union Army and the Confederate Army was an option for many enslaved folks and self-emancipated folks to be away from their enslaver, to earn freedom, right, as promised, earn manumission, as promised in some Union camps, right, and in a very tiny few Confederate camps, but I digress. Right, his mother was also an enslaved person who was literate. Now, just for a moment, I'm going to go on a small tangent and push back on this idea of enslaved folks being illiterate, right? First, I want to say that there are many different levels to literacy. And what we use with our 21st century eyes to gauge the literacy of folks in enslavement may not be adequate. Right, may not be adequate. What do you mean? Well, it was an institution of enslavement. These folks, these Black folks, these Africans were at their whole person and their mind belonged to their enslaver in a lot of cases. So what does that mean? In a lot of cases, these enslavers taught their enslaved people how to read in order so that the enslaver's life could be made easier. So I always like to push back on this idea of full literacy, clear literacy in the way that we know it today, right? Especially when it comes to K through 12 education and the history of that institution as well. So enough with the tangent, right? So Carter G. Woodson's mother, Eliza, also born enslaved, but was fortunate enough to gain some levels of literacy, so much so that she taught her 9 children. Carter G. Woodson is one of 9, which is amazing, right? Given the time in which she was born. And so when we think more about Woodson's life and where he gets the motivation to continue his education, right? Education for young Black folks, particularly men, was an economic sacrifice that many families could not afford. What does that mean? Many families couldn't afford for their young, unmarried male children to be at school, right? It means they weren't doing the economic work to bring in money for the family. So it was definitely a sacrifice on Carter G. Woodson's family and of himself, right? Because we know the economic outlook of teachers. And let's just say it can be bleak depending on who you're speaking to and the day. And that existed even back then. And when we think of Carter G. Woodson maneuvering through this post-war America, trying to seek education, doing in a lot of ways sometimes antithetical to what's expected of Black men at the time, particularly Black men born of formerly enslaved parents, right? He's shattering a lot of ceilings, moving upward, right, intellectually. And so when we think about his early life and how he maneuvered from pillar to post, literally working as a carpenter, working as blacksmith, right, in order to earn funding for education. He started high school at the age of 20, right? 20 years old. This is how dedicated this person was to intellectual expansion, right? After he begins to do early education, his thirst increases. Carter G. Woodson thirsts increase for knowledge. He ends up at Brea College, right? I believe that's in Kentucky. You know anything about Brea College? We know that's the home of renowned scholar Bell Hooks, right? He ends up at Brea College for a few semesters, but is unable to fully pay and has to, has a revolving door kind of experience with education until he lands at Harvard, right? First Black man to earn the degree of history, PhD of history from Harvard. Second Black man to graduate from Harvard, only under and after Du Bois, right? So these are monumental strivings in the world that Du Bois is living in. And as he's living and working and traveling, he's noticing how much work educationally he has to do to dismantle white supremacist narratives around Black folks and the Black experience in the US and throughout the world. Because he has to subsidize his education with work, he teaches in DC, he teaches in Virginia, he teaches in the Philippines for years, travels throughout Asia and Africa prior to 1926. And everywhere he goes, he remarks about these rumors, these ideas, these stereotypes about the American Black, or about the experiences of the descendants of the enslaved. It's remarkable, right? It's downright remarkable. Uh, and so it leads into the next point. Why did he think teaching Black history was of great import? Because again, he's traveling all around the world teaching. And he's realizing that most have this misinterpretation of what it's of the experience of those who were enslaved and those who did the enslaving and the implications of that in the teaching field to him were urgent, right? Quite urgent. Quite urgent. And so even when we think of the early impact of Dr. Woodson's promoting African American history, now let me let you know how, right? How did he promote it without Google, without Twitter, without Facebook? How did he go around? I'm going to tell you, door to door, day to day. Carter G. Woodson had such gumption. He was speaking in churches, in rehabilitation homes, in orphanages, in elementary schools, for the women's clubs, for the men's clubs, for the Elks, for society people, in church missions. He was speaking to anyone who would listen for years for free, going around absolutely dispelling harmful, negative ideas about Black folks. Absolutely. 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 When I think about the total lack of technology that was available to Dr. Woodson at the time, I just get flabbergasted. Because in all of that, we have this contemporary phrase, boots on the ground. Absolutely, Dr. Woodson was boots on the ground for tearing down these racist, problematic illusions about Black folks and about the Black experience here in the United States and throughout the diaspora, right? And it's not just him, right? I don't want to center it on Carter G. Woodson. Absolutely a phenomenal figure, right? After he graduates from Harvard, right, he does this world traveling. Graduates from Harvard with a PhD in 1912. And between earning the PhD and founding Negro History Week, right, he cooperates with a group of other Black intellectuals, mostly male, and creates ASALA, right? Association for the Study of African American Life and History, right? And back then, Dr. Woodson called it a historical alliance. So he sought out like-minded educators, theorists, intellectuals, and activists to say, hey, let's discuss why our experiences are worthy of academic inquiry past that of narratives that don't serve us, right? And so all of these compatriots were like, yes, absolutely. Mary Church Terrell had already, famous Black woman, had already been observing the birthdays of Frederick Douglass, famous Black man, abolitionist, right, and Abraham Lincoln in her school teachings. So even in her curriculum, and it's so crazy, well, it's not crazy, pardon me, it's quite ridiculous to know that the work it takes to form a curriculum, to form an inclusive curriculum, starts years before some of these students are even born. The honest, earnest work it takes to find folks to cooperate with, demystify the negative and impactful narratives around Black life in America. What courage it takes, right? What insight it takes. And again, this is curriculum reform before we get to any type of formalized public schools. This is before a lot of universities have even broke ground, right? You have this cadre of Black scholars discussing what it's like to be in the shadow of this post-war America, be in the shadow of this enslavement institution, right? I just wanted, that was another tangent. So again, yes, between earning this PhD and doing this boots on the ground type lecture work all over the US and in parts of Asia and Africa, Woodson selected this week, along with others, right, that would aim to educate the true version of African American history, right? So by September 1915, and again, this is all before we get Negro History Week. So again, it shows you the strategy and the purposefulness of folks involved in this endeavor. So in 1915, the alliance, this historical alliance of Black scholars, right, transformed and established himself into an organization called, right, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, as an adage to what I said before, right? And this was in Chicago, one of the burgeoning northern cities, supposedly welcoming Black folks out of the South into the North for better economic opportunities. And so even in the founding of the association, which it is known affectionately as to folks who are in it, even to know the association was formed in such of a bustling Black space, right, shows the intentionality of Dr. Woodson and his comrades, right? And then, so we're thinking to our of our neighbors in the East from here, right? In Chicago, we think about how folks who look like me, folks who look like Mrs. Beatrice Kennedy here in this picture, to my right, but perhaps to your left, I'm not sure. We see folks like Beatrice Kennedy, who was a remarkable Black woman, led a fascinating life here in Oregon prior to 1926, right? Has training as a lawyer, has training as an editor, edited one of the first newspapers and Black-led and owned newspapers here in the Pacific Northwest and Oregon, right? An activist who hosted other activists throughout her experiences with anti-Blackness here in the Pacific Northwest. She actually wrote to James Weldon Johnson, National Secretary of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, right? So James Weldon Johnson, who I referenced earlier as, you know, the composer and writer of the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, absolutely integral, important in helping Black folks establish themselves here, stand here now, right? So the idea of legacy and trajectory isn't lost on me, right? This idea of a small amount of nationhood, because nationhood gets dangerous, right? A small amount of nationhood, but as also a much larger amount of recovery, right? Of recovering this idea, reminding the world of Black humanity in the face of anti-Blackness, right? Prior to 1926. Very important to notice that as well, right? Because even prior to Beatrice Kennedy arriving here in the Pacific Northwest, we know of the Black man, Mr. York, well, I don't want to say Mr. York, who arrived with Lewis and Clark, who established himself and arrived under the auspices of enslavement, right? Arrived here with those two explorers and helped to establish this land, one of the first folks to even wander around this place we call Portland contemporarily. But in his life work, had to, upon their return to St. Louis, got his freedom. That's why I say he he's seminal in our idea of understanding Black history, particularly here in the West. And, you know, very early in this, like 1804, right? 1803, he is manumitted, right? So he's given his freedom by law in 1806, which again leads me to believe, you know, he came here under the auspices of being enslaved, right? Carpenter, he was an interpreter, York was, for Lewis and Clark with the local indigenous folks. So again, we want to talk about literacy. We want to talk about Black ingenuity. And it existed long before we went on record celebrating it, right? And it existed long before some of this race science got popularized, right? Race science, which pushes this idea of Black inferiority, right? Generally speaking. So again, we just want to push back on that. So we have Beatrice Kennedy, we have York, we also have Marcus Lopez out of the diaspora, right? One of the first explorers to this landmass. Also happens to be a Black man. Also happens to be somebody we would consider Black today, right? That's important to say. Originally born in Cape Verde and came here as a cabin boy and never left. Here now we stand, right? That lyric is it sticks out to me so brightly because it's an affirmation to the idea of citizenry. Not a discovery, but the citizenry, the declaration of citizenry, right? In our own words. So you have Black folks here living and thriving in the contexts of their own environments in this place called Oregon, right? Awesome, excuse me, very awesome to think about. And so now when we think about the establishment of Negro History Week in 1926 and what that looks like and how the association is working on all levels of education and society in order to bring African American history to the wider conversation of the American experience and the experience of African Americans, descendants of Africans here, right? And so when we think about the expansion even of the idea of this cooperative effort to strive to tell the African American in history, the African in history, right? Awesome. Awesome. And then when we think about what's going on here in Oregon during that time, or Oregon country, as a lot of the literature says, which I love, Oregon country, right? That's how I say it, like a car commercial, right? And so in this talk, again, you know, we're centering where African Americans were, where Carter G. Woodson was, and the like, which is absolutely important. But I highlight that it doesn't mean that folks were living in absolute distress, but it doesn't mean that remnants of the Confederacy, remnants of the Union, right, which gets placed in this better light historically, right? We look back more kindly on the Union. But it's not to say that Black folks didn't have a difficult time here, right? We know the exclusion laws of these laws that say if you're here for too long as a Black person working, right, get out or get 50 lashes or get put in jail or in the hard work camp. And so in the late 1840s and 50s, we see folks going down on the record trying to stymie Black progress, right? So I say all that to say for that last slide. I didn't forget, and neither should you. So the Oregonian enterprise of Black history between 1926 and 1948, right, sees this expansion in population, in business savvy, in thought, and access to education, and access to other resources. We see this total boom here, right? And so in this phase, we are thinking about folks who are charting different paths, right? So if we talk about here now we stand at last, okay, then where are we stepping? What motivates, what orders our steps here as Black folks in the Pacific Northwest, and particularly in Oregon, right? And I think of folks like in 1928, J.L. Caston, right? A young minister out of one of the first Black churches here, Mount Olivet Baptist Church. I need you to know that J.L. Caston, Reverend Caston, grew the NAACP membership in 1928 in the Pacific Northwest to 646 people. That is monumental. Again, so far away from essentially the Mecca of Blackness in the Southeast. What kind of ingenuity and gumption does it take to garner 646 souls to be a part of the NAACP in Oregon? Now we know the NAACP is a interracial organization, right? So even the prowess to invite non-Black folks, the ingenuity and brilliance it takes to even hold space for that amount of people. That's in 1928, right? So we think of, after this 1926 moment, Dr. Woodson is on the downslope, right? He's done his work. Certainly he's had boots on the ground, and he's spread the idea of Negro History Week and Black History Month to as far as he can take it, right? And he's done great work for literally being the child, one of 9 children of enslaved folks in Virginia, which we know anything about Virginia history, had a peculiar type of peculiar institution there. And so in this phase of the enterprise of Black history, we see torchbearers, we see Carter G. Woodson handing off the torch, and we see Black folks here in Oregon taking it up and being prideful, right? This third bullet point says coincides with early Great Migration from southern states to northern and western states, right? So even in this establishment of Negro History Week, right? 1915, 1917, 1926, to now is absolutely motivated by this idea of Black folks coming out of our historical American space, right? Really flexing our citizenship in other spaces as we know it to be so, right? Like Frederick Douglass always said, I'm paraphrasing. He taught himself to read, not so much that he could, be pen pals, not so much that he could write great literature, so that he could understand the laws that governed him. And so post-war, post our first couple of Negro History Weeks, right, which happen annually, Black folks are in this great migration, the great Negro artist Jacob Lawrence does a migration series where he documents how Black folks got up out of the South, right? By train, by foot, by wagon, hook or crook, in the depths of night. Here now we stand, right? (1859), we know Oregon becomes the first state. That should have been on the last slide. But in this statehood moment, in this infancy of being a state, Oregon has a give and take, this tit for tat relationship with Black folks, right? Sometimes for years, it's years of being left alone, years of not applying the Exclusion Act, right? Years. Because we know that Black folks were coming in and being this very important, thriving workforce, right? We think about the depression that occurs in this phase of the Black history enterprise, right? The Great Depression as well. That's what it's the Great Depression. How housing insecurities, particularly here, become almost insurmountable for Black folks, right? How race pride increases among the transplant white folks that are coming here post-war, post-Confederacy, some of them with their lost cause ideas and musings, right? So during this time, Oregon is hustling and bustling, absolutely feeling amplified effects from these phenomena, the Great Migration, this post-war, post-emancipation era, the Great Depression, right? Those things are amplified here. Even with this commitment by many for this interracial cooperation for the betterment of most folks, right? Going back to Reverend Caston, expanding the NAACP throughout the state, right? Here now we stand. Black folks came here and they got established. So here, just a moment of levity, have a few photos of Black folks in Oregon prior to 1926. Right. Pictured here atop, I'm gonna use my cursor if I can. W.D. Allen, founder of first Black-owned hotel in Oregon, the Golden West Hotel, employed Black folks, welcomed Black folks, helped establish a lot of these women's club societies, right? A lot of their first meetings and important meetings happened at this hotel. Picture below Mr. Allen is Dr. J.D. Merriman, Portland's first Black medical doctor, should say Black medical doctor, right? And so I just want you to just take a moment and look at these. We're going to exclude all of this elegance. Are we going to exclude all of this Black excellence? I just need us to understand that Black folks were leaving homes they had known, their ancestral homes, many of them, like Carter G. Woodson. He grew up, he was reared outside the plantation where his father worked before his father self-emancipated. So there's a strange relationship we have to the land. There's a strange pride we have in the land. And so for folks to leave their ancestral home looking just as dapper, being just as well educated, to come here and live under exclusion laws, shame. Shock and a shame. Another photo. Picture top here is McCants Stewart, 1899, first black man practiced law in Oregon country, right? Pushing back on this idea of citizenship, pushing back on this idea of black folks being perpetual visitors to this entire landmass, and specifically the Pacific Northwest, right? I know that's been my own experience. It's like, oh, treated like a visitor that's been around too long, right? Again, black folks were coming here on all social stratification levels. We think of folks like York, who arrived as an enslaved person, right? Worked as a carpenter, interpreter. We think of Mrs. Beatrice Canaday, who came here with her husband and created a whole family and set of life experiences that still have historical ripple and implications today in Portland, right? Absolutely amazing. So we think of the Oregon Enterprise between 1948 and 1972. Now, these years, coincidentally, are situated between two natural disasters. Two natural disasters. And like when Malcolm X says, when America gets a cold, Black America gets pneumonia, right? So situated in 1948, we know the historic flood of Vanport. We are post-World War II. Hundreds of Black men and their families arrive here to help out with the war effort, right? To be economically sound, right? That's, important to these Black folks who are leaving their ancestral homes in the South, East, and Southwest, right? Southern to us right here. All of those folks who are leaving Missouri when Missouri was a haven for self-emancipated and free Black folks, right? You have these natural disasters. Yes. But when we think of how much, and I'm just going to say it because it's after 5 and we're all cool now, how much anti-Blackness, it was an emergency in anti-Blackness before the national disaster even occurred, right? Before that storm in May in 48, before that, there were so many intentional occurrences of anti-Blackness, things done to ensure that Black folks, again, who came here, who relocated here in order to help out with the war effort, to be citizens. There was so much already on the record to manipulate their housing security in the way that the homes were built, in the land that the homes took up, in the developing of it, and the amount of money paid for those, which I hear not very well made, right? So before this natural disaster of this flood of Vanport, right, there were some practical disasters that folks took part in order to amplify the devastation to the Black folks who suffered through that. Right? Here now we stand at last. Here now we stand until the white gleam of our bright star is cast. And there's several local historical efforts, right, to recover and to tell the story of Vanport and those Black folks. I won't overshadow their work being done because I'm engaging it as well as you are, right? But just to know that it exists in a lineage of practical, avoidable disasters, which also happen to be anti-Black, that all seem to converge when there is a natural disaster. That doesn't seem coincidental. Oh, that does not seem coincidental. Right. So we have legislative movements. In 1943, Public Accommodations Law, 53, which means that Black folks pushed and pressed to be accommodated in public spaces. This is 1953, so this is prior to the death of Emmett Till. This is prior to the decision coming down from Brown v. Board, right? This is prior to the bus boycott. Black folks here pushed, right, for public accommodation laws along with their white allies, because what was happening is that Black folks were going places where they had normally been welcomed. Movie theaters, banks, restaurants. And then, like the flip of a switch, all of a sudden they were unwelcome. No Blacks allowed, no coloreds allowed. We've seen the signs. And we thought the signs only existed, silly us, we thought the signs only existed in southern states. But no. Mm-mm. Here now we stand, door to door, boots on the ground, Black people asserting their citizenry in every realm of society. In 1962, we have the Urban Renewal Law, right? Not law, excuse me, or urban renewal projects for Albina, neighborhoods. So even after the flood in Vanport devastates Black communities, Black home ownership, Black economic opportunities, our local powers that be in that time enacted urban renewal. Okay, let's welcome the folks back, right? Right? Several organizations were created. Several interracial organizations were created, right? The Albina Neighborhood Investment Council, right? Portland loves a good acronym. Still getting used to that. We also have Sunday in the Park, right? This idea of agitators arriving in Irvington Park in Portland to agitate local Black Panthers and local activists into engaging with the police, right? That's the account. I'm choosing my words sparingly, right? I wasn't there. So when we think again about what's going on nationally and how we had all of this national news and this national education on North versus South, East versus West, it's way more accommodating to be in the West, are things that we hear said on our news, in our textbooks. But I need us to understand, right? Much like what Malcolm X said, paraphrasing, anything south of Canada is the South for Black people. Which is why when Black folks came here, particularly to Oregon, to the Pacific Northwest, they had the same ideas about their freedom, about their personhood, about their citizenry, about their humanity that they had at their homestead. That's what's been part intriguing about doing the research for this presentation, is the zeal and tenacity of these Black folks who arrive here and stay here and do family here and education and law here. It's a total affront to the legacies of the lost cause. It's a total affront. So I love it. I chuckle at it. So in 1972, we have the completion of the Albina Neighborhood Improvement Project, which, like improvement projects of the past, came with great criticism, right? And this movement, I mention these because, again, they question the legitimacy of Black people seeking citizenry and home here. right? Or that they can, which to me is directly in Carter G. Woodson's, it's in Asala's legacy. The Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH, right? We are in his legacy. Oregonians, Black Oregonians are in his legacies from prior to 1800s. So when we meet James Weldon Johnson, he composes this Black national anthem. He's literally taking words out of the wind. He is taking our experiences out of the land that we have been a part of, that we have known. When I say we, I mean collective Black folks. We have known that we are a part of, right? And this is the talk I wish I would have received upon my arrival to Oregon and Portland. I'm not going to lie to you. So I hope y'all are with me. And so when we think about the Oregonian enterprise contemporarily, right? Also can't forget to mention Seminole activist, organizer, Kent Ford, right? Seminole in maintaining Black Panther offices, right? Medical clinics, dentist clinics, school feeding programs for children. Him and his compatriots are to be celebrated, right? Absolutely in that legacy of Carter G. Woodson. I think about the contemporary work of Dr. Darrell Milner, Professor Emeritus in my own Department of Black Studies at Portland State University, who continually, right, publishes in our local Black newspapers, The Advocate, The Scanner, right, The Observer, on contemporary Black housing issues, right? I think about Rukiah Adams in this lovely TED Talk called A Love Letter to Portland. A sixth-generation Black person from Portland out here expressing to the world, much like Carter G. Woodson did, her love for the Black folks in a place that didn't always love them. Right? I think of Dr. Joyce DeGruy, author of Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, seminal text. I think about Avell Gordley, who helped get exclusion laws and slavery laws off the books for good here. I think about folks who are, as Booker T. Washington would say as well, who are casting down their buckets, who came here not necessarily with an accommodationist spirit to accommodate anti-racism, no, but to accommodate the promises made to all American citizens under these pieces of paper, right? Under the Bill of Rights, under the amendments, right? These are folks who are calling, not even into question, calling up to stand the promises made on these pieces of paper, right? And again, they have the zeal, they have the tenacity to make it so. And not too many people know that narrative. And so I'm thankful to having the space to do the research. I'm thankful to the folks, the Black folks who have come before me, all of the porters, all of the home aid workers, right? All of the janitors, all of the educators who have come before me in this space to do this kind of work. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about citations. And I thought I was talking fast, but it turns out I'm ending right on time. And shout out to Bob Abbey for bringing up Elizabeth McLaglin's book, A Peculiar Paradise, because it is exactly what we all need to be reading. And I will probably chime in on her presentation, on their presentation as well. Because it is absolutely, it expanded my mind so much in doing this research for this talk. And I'm very thankful for the research being done. I have another text here called Perseverance, the History of African Americans in Oregon's Marion and Polk counties. Right. And this book is supported by the Oregon Northwest Black Pioneers, right? Another organization dedicated to recovering Black history here in the Pacific Northwest and sharing Black history of the Pacific Northwest with the rest of America. Okay. Also, I have citations from, I'm not sure this book is in print anymore, but I will share it with you on my screen and also read the title. Dr. Woodson gets a lot of accolade for the text he wrote called The Miseducation of the Negro. And it is a wonderful text. However, he wrote another, and he actually wrote several. And the one I used to engage with for this research today, The Education of the Negro Prior to 1861. Yes, the education of the Negro, right? Prior to 1861, which is again why I push back on these notions of, of literacy when discussing Black folks who existed back then, right? I just want to say thank you again for having me out in the Zoom sphere, in the stream sphere, to speak with you all today. And we can wrap up and do questions and comments. I'm happy to take them. I'm happy to chat with you all. So I'm going to stop my share and we can get into it. Thank you.
Thanks, Courtney. Really amazing distillation of this rich history, and so many of the names and places that you mentioned um, are things that should be on everybody's consciousness, right? And I want to talk about a couple of them in just a minute, but I want to remind everybody, please post your comments and questions in the chat box on whatever platform you're watching tonight, whether it's YouTube or Facebook. This is a way for you to enter into the conversation. So please take advantage of that. I also posted a link to Rakaya Adams' TED Talk,
Yes.
a love letter, Portland. So take a look at that. It's a really remarkable presentation. And if you haven't seen it, watch it. If you have seen it, we'll watch it again, because I think it really shines a light on the history of this place that we all live in. And whether we're in Portland or whether we're around Portland, I think it puts so much of this history into perspective. Another resource that I would mention, just to build on the ones that Courtney mentioned, is the Oregon Historical Society's Oregon Encyclopedia. Courtney mentioned Dr. Daryl Milner, who has been a seminal presence in helping to shape the conversation about the Black experience in Oregon. And
Absolutely.
he has written a number of excellent articles for the Oregon Encyclopedia. I will post a link to that right now. One of the nice things about having two computers is that I can do this. And they have right now, as part of Black History Month, a number of articles of folks that I bet none of us have ever heard of. For instance, Charles Ray Jordan, Mary Carr, Mary Beatty, Beatrice Kennedy, who Courtney talked about earlier, all of whom are part of that fabric of the Black experience in Oregon. So where to start? I want to touch a little bit on your discussion of literacy, and I think the way that you reframed and reclaimed that term, I think is really interesting and important, because it seems that when we think of literacy, what we're thinking about is a very specific white-centered approach to how information is shared and how community is made. And I think you really draw a line around the fact that there are other ways that those things can happen. And in particular, because you mentioned um, music, I think that that's another important part of how the Black experience is communicated. Have you done much work at all with the relationship between the Black communities and music and how that fits into the Black experience?
Thank you for that question. Absolutely. Um, I would consider myself on along the lines of my research rather in ethnomusicology and in Black music studies and Black music traditions. And so literacy, yes, is integral in these times of when we think of early African American music or even early American music, which is the field hollers, right? These call and response tunes being sung, screamed, hollered during the workday in various plantation um, environments, right? So we have that oral tradition of hearing signs, of feeling signs, feeling the timbre, feeling the beat change, right? So there's a reading in that as well. I also want to mention the quilts from Gee's Bend, how these master quilt makers would take these old tattered uh masses old coat, right, for lack of better terms, in a lot of ways, and turn it into a piece that could be read, right? That if hung a certain way over a banister could be read as an alert, read as a notice to self emancipate, right? So there's levels of reading happening. I was just discussing with one of my comrades as well. We think about the convict leasing and about how these Black men were enlarged, just rounded up for very sketch vagrancy laws, right? And uh, part of their penalty would be they couldn't read. So now we have to give them more time, right? And the way they would judge this would be by the signatures of these men. And these signatures, although they may not be the full accurate spelling of this man's name, the symbol that they affix as their name, as the signature is read, and I'm sure could be read opposite someone else's. I'm sure that person could tell their signature mark over someone else's and the importance and the implications of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think literacy is particularly when it comes back to music, we were during enslavement allowed a certain proximity to whiteness, to the enslaved, because of music performance, right? I always think about those scenes in the original Roots film, which I do recommend. It is quite accurate to most contemporary films. And I think about that character Fiddler, right? How his whole existence centered around reading the entertainment, reading the leisure of the white folks that enslaved him, which is just like ironic on so many levels, right? And so I think about that and how even in his dying breath, this is the depiction of it on film. Uh, the first time he actually played his own song was with his dying effort, right? So this ability to be able to lead yourself into the next level, into the next realm of life, right? Outside of the traditional canonical text that we know and love. Yes, I always have to push back on that. Always have to push back on these ideas of literacy and how folks came to know what they know and the value system we judge it up against.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And you've, in your own work, explored aspects of hip hop culture. How do you see that fitting into this long arc, this long narrative?
What a great question. I absolutely see it in this long arc of claiming citizenry here in this land, claiming humanity, right, in the face of so much. And in studying hip hop, I taught a class here recently at Portland State, and it in it we did a comparative literature, right? So we compared the genre of the slave narrative to these contemporary memoirs of contemporary rappers. So is the life in times of Frederick Douglass like Blueprint by Jay-Z, that they have some similar experiences just by being black men reared up in this land space? And what is that like? And what are the implications of this billionaire rapper making a foray into the autobiographical genre? Like, what are the implications? Because, like you said, this long arc, they change over time. And so when we think of the motivations that led Frederick Douglass to writing his life story and sharing it, he's saying, listen, because I'm an abolitionist, you must know how terrible this is out of somebody who's self-emancipated. You must understand, and taught themselves how to read. So even the motivation, the root wasn't this closeness to white safety or this closeness to the idea of keeping whiteness safe. Frederick Douglass in teaching him himself to read and self emancipating, Jay-Z in crafting and building and maintaining this monumental career, right? There are some similarities. And so that was what this last course we investigated. And of course, Jay-Z wasn't the only rapper we engaged, or the Frederick Douglass the only enslaved person or formerly enslaved person we engaged. But it was a hard fought battle. It was an adjustment for our students to begin to think about these people who we celebrate in this way, to be in this lineage of these folks who weren't considered human for centuries. So it was I watched them be jarred. It was very eye opening as an educator,
Hmm.
and I'm excited to do it again. Quite frankly, yes.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty transformative experience for everyone. Um, so you also I like the term you use when you talk about self-emancipated, and again, it seems that it's about reclaiming agency, right? It's not about someone gave this to you or someone granted this to you, which seems to suggest that there was no agency. But the idea of self-liberation seems to carry with it not only the physical act of liberation, but also the spiritual, the mental, the physiological, the psychological liberation as well, and that all happens within. So, can you talk a little bit about that, that sense of reclaiming how we talk about what happened to formerly enslaved persons?
I love it. I think it's time to not switch the narrative, but elevate the narrative, right? This is what I tell
Mhm.
my students often. I said, black folks freed themselves. Black folks freed themselves. The only way Harriet Tubman knew the route to freedom was after she freed herself. That's the only way she came to know it. There was no map. There was no sidekick. The only way she came to know it is when she decided that freedom was the only option, right? And I think that when we think of Frederick Douglass, who I love, right, who had a fight with his overseer more than once in order to claim some type of agency and humanity over himself in those moments. And so, what I would like to remind my students and even the folks here on this call is that there were day to day interactions. There were day to day fisticuffs on these enslavement sites where folks were not putting up with certain things. I think about Robert Smalls, who stole a Confederate boat, drove it, I mean, steered it past Confederate uh, um, signposts and posts in the water and steered it to the Union Army. Black folks freed themselves because the folks enslaving us, could not write tales like that. They couldn't write tales like that. I think about the Crafts, William and Ellen Craft, who escaped enslavement because Ellen was fair skinned enough, enslaved by her own father, and then her stepsister became her mistress, right? Enslaved by her own family, and then self grew up, reared, had a husband who was enslaved, and they crafted an idea, pun intended, to to dress in disguises. Ellen dressed as a man, a disabled man, a man in a sling, because they did not know how to write. So they couldn't write papers. She couldn't write papers for her husband. So they crafted an idea of freedom and they executed it and maintained their freedom, so much so that their descendants are still walking this planet. So I think, black folks freed themselves because we know Lincoln wanted to send black people to what is now Panama, right? We know the experiment with Liberia was hard. It was difficult for those black folks who did leave in the early 1820s, 1820s, I believe, to go to Liberia at the behest of Oglethorpe in Georgia. But see, the issue there was is that they took these ideas, the ideas that enslaved folks here, and tried to do that there. And that didn't work for several reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I Black folks freeing themselves expands our historical narrative on what was possible. And it also, again, it highlights the day-to-day violence that was occurring. Because if you say black folks freed themselves, and then a thinking person would say, well, what took so long? Well, why didn't you all just make a plan to leave? But that undercuts the extreme violence and the ubiquity of the institution of enslavement. It undercuts that ubiquity, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think about Margaret Garner, free for 2 hours, then recaptured and called crazy in all of the media, called ridiculous for wanting to leave enslavement. Sorry, I could
And
go on.
no. I mean, even in my lifetime, I can remember the narrative of the happy slave. I mean, it is not that, it's not distant history, right? It is
Correct.
definitely a part of our current history,
Mhm.
and in many places is still a part of how that narrative is formed. Um,
Mhm.
and I just appreciate that the refocusing and the the shifting of, it's not just about what you call it, it's not just about giving it another name, right? It's about actually shifting the perspective and
Mhm.
and and really thinking about what that means and that sense of agency. So I appreciate you presenting that as a an alternative to the way I think many of us have been um, taught and socialized to think about that experience. Um,
Thank you for that.
in your discussion about Portland, you mentioned a number uh, of locations, and I think a couple of years ago we had Walidia Marisha,
Yes,
and
my
and
colleague.
yes,
Yes.
and we talked a bit about in her live stream about some of the institutions in Portland, and I want to just kind of touch on a couple of them, and get your comments and observations. Um, I think one of the most significant institutions in Portland, as far as Black history is concerned, is the church. And you mentioned Mount Olivet, right?
Mhm.
Um, and the role that that played in the community. Um, can you talk a little bit about that presence of the church in North Portland and how that really helped to shape the community? Do we need to give you more time? Do we need?
No, no, it's fine. I see the clock, but as a Black studies scholar, right? So sometimes people conflate Black studies with the study of a person who happens to be Black, right?
Yeah.
And so I get excited when we talk about the Black church as an institution in Black studies, because without it, we wouldn't have half of the things, we wouldn't even have half of some of the records that we call our own, right? One of my good colleagues in Atlanta, Georgia, just hosted Martin Luther King's historic church, Ebenezer, in a oral storytelling campaign to invite the elders back to tell their stories in an oral campaign. But that's in another time zone. So when we think about churches here and the impact of the Black church here, my mother has a quote and it says, "You take you with you." So these folks who traveled here for the economic opportunity, for the opportunity to not be called the N word again, that was a large thrust of the Great Migration. Folks tired of the second class citizenry. Like, we know the story of called George, no matter what their name was, no matter what the state was, right? So we Black folks are just fed up. But the church historically has been a safe place of reprieve, of organizing, of activism work, of joy making, right? Of the ritual of funerals, which I think, really is really the main goal of our Black churches, to usher us into that peace we may not have known in the place that we lived, right? Because the church ceremony itself, that Sunday experience, is to help you do the day to day, right? It's help you Sunday to Sunday to do the week, right? But that funeral experience is to honor your whole life, right? And your association with that community of parishioners, of practitioners, right? And so when we think of the Black church and we think of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, home of Robert Smalls, home of Robert Pinckney, the Black man shot down in the Charleston shootings, right? Elected official, I bring him up to say all of that, right? Person who made Black history, lived Black history. We've got to think about how these churches aided the freedom movement, aided the liberation movement, and how these folks came here to do church, to take up that realm of social life and do spirit work. Again, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, historic as one of the first churches to allow Black folks to pray alongside white folks, right? And so, what is it? Is Mount Zion AME Church here is the oldest church here, still existing, has moved a couple of times, but exists now off the corner of Skidmore and Vancouver in Portland. And it's still, the architecture is, harkens back to old times. And so I love that when I pass by it. I've not visited. I did ask some members what they were doing for Black history. And so I'm still putting that call out. The church is, I want to say it's the clock. It tells us the time of day, politically, socially, economically, of the local Black community. And so even here, again, so far away from the home of these churches, Black folks were able to do ritual and maintain their sanity, maintain their traditions. Pardon me, even in the midst of all of this anti-Blackness and exclusionary laws and things of that nature. And I know the story about the KKK buying the wood for the church to be built away from them. And really what that speaks to is that, like I tell my students, is the how unreasonable white supremacy can be sometimes, how downright comical and unreasonable it can be at sometimes. And so I think I do that to reframe and demystify it, take it out of this boogeyman status, and really let's talk about and deal with how ridiculous some of this stuff can be. But yeah,
Mm. Hmm. Well, and the church too. I mean, we mentioned music, so music is at the core, right? And that's that sense of expression. But I think that
large choir scene here, which
yeah,
I love, which reminds me of the times my grandmother speaks of and going to see choirs and traveling choirs and black composers and choir leaders. So I'm interested to engage that tradition more here as well. Sorry to interrupt,
yeah.
but
No,
that's very important for interracial community work, for allyship, for the continuance of traditions. I know Daryl Grant at PSU works very hard at connecting social justice to music and locally and throughout the nation. So I'm excited about that. Just a little adage.
and also the church was in many ways the location in the community where people got health care, where they got there were social activities, there were all of those things that helped to create that community, and particularly in times when neighborhoods were gentrifying, right, and they were getting pulled apart. The church often served as a magnet. It was a real nexus for that activity, and I think
Absolutely.
that's another piece of Portland's history. As we think about um, the very difficult history Portland has with housing discrimination and racism, and you look at the Black church, and it is one of the true community-based assets in Portland, and continues to be. And I think, as you mentioned with Mount Olivet, um, an institution that we should all explore and discover. Another
Absolutely.
location that you mentioned, which is actually, I think, one of my favorites, is the Golden West. And what's interesting about that is that in addition to being this very important place in Portland history, the strands of that history stretch out through contemporary Portland with the Bogle family, and how that that institution, which, even though it closed, still had a lasting tradition and was recently put on the National Register of Historic Places. Um,
Wonderful.
yeah.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah. No, I just you reminded me about the National Historic Marker and exactly it. And even bringing up these famous Black families, like I tell my students, I'm so glad you did this. I know we have just a minute, but we play so much up this founding father idea, these founding families, and we don't understand that other kinds of Americans helped build this family too, and acquired wealth and redistributed that wealth in a way that wasn't totally obscene. And so I think of how Frederick Douglass's grandchildren and Booker T. Washington's grandchildren made a family, and how they are related, and Kenneth Morris is related to Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass, and how these lines and these families still exist in order to do this kind of work, even outside of academia. So I get excited about that, Bob. I'm not gonna
mhm.
lie.
Well, and I'm looking at a photo of the Golden West Hotel barbershop, and it's a great photo, and the caption, which I think is just absolutely great, it says Waldo Bogle, proprietor, and then underneath it says physiognomical hairdressers, facial operators, cranium manipulators, and capillary abridgers, and skeet. What is that? Oh, skeet mobile operator. It's just, and they're sitting around. I mean, it's this wonderful image of probably 9 or 10 uh, African American men, several of them with hats, staring at the camera, and it's a wonderful picture, and I love that caption. It just is. It's such a nice nod to the sense of importance, but not taking themselves too importantly. Um, and interestingly enough, Golden West was probably the first location of jazz in Portland back in 1914 with Freddie Keppard.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so again, another connection to music. Um, Courtney, I know we could probably talk forever about some of the different strands that you mentioned. I want to just shift the gears a little bit in the time that we have left. We talked before we went on about the class that you're teaching right now at PSU, and you talked about how some of your students are kind of grappling with the material. Um, can you talk just a little bit about that class, and without getting into a lot of specifics, without necessarily calling out anybody or identifying, what are some of the things that they're having to confront with that material?
Thank you for that. And a great question. This term, I teach Black political thought, and I center it in the US, right? So I start the course. I'm not going to lie to you, Bob. I start the course with the scene from Amistad, right? The boat scene, the Middle Passage scene, when
Mm,
folks who look like me are in the bows of these ships, and you hear the moaning, the groaning, the agony, the sorrow, the anguish. And then you also see them trying to communicate with one another, right? You see a person succumb to their experiences, and they're all chained together. You see a baby being born and passed forward, right? So it's a very intense scene that if you don't know what you're looking at, you may have to rewatch it. Like it's a very intense scene. And so I start my courses with that, so that not to shock or to jar folks, so that folks understand what is in the mindset of a Black person who wants to do political work, right? Regardless of party affiliation, there are some base level understandings that folks have to have. And so right now we're about heading into week 6, I believe. And so we just covered in this Black political thought course, Ida B. Wells, right? Seminal Black woman, reporter, educator, part newspaper owner, founder, the Niagara movement and almost, NAACP. Very important Black woman, led the campaign against lynching. And we read the story of essentially her homeboys in Mississippi, who were put out of their grocery store that they owned, the grocery, by a former owner, a white man who had came in there and accused the current owners of housing a fugitive, right? And from that accusatory moment, 3 of her homeboys ended up unalive, right? And so Ida B. Wells writes about that experience and how there were so many, again, there were so many disasters, intentional disasters that led up to their demise that could have been avoided. And concurrently, these Black men and their families were following the law to the letter. They had hired lawyers, they had done the overnight time, thinking they were going to get, however outrageous it was, some kind of a legitimate punishment that wasn't death. And so we grapple with that, and then knowing what's going on contemporarily in the nation in K through 12, particularly in a state called Florida, right? And how even what we're learning could be considered as contraband and stay soon, and how insightful that is, knowing that some of my students are also parents and also have to have hard conversations contemporarily about things that have been historically so for so long that they felt like they couldn't afford to make the space to acknowledge what's been going on. But this course has helped them to make the steps to go around that fear, to confront what they think is occurring and recurring, right, in the nation, in their communities, right? So I try to give them some space. One of my students, I'll just very briefly, one of my students has an undergraduate student that they sent to the East to a university in Boston. And they were reading about, I believe it was the crafts, right? Ellen and William Craft, who actually went through Boston on their self-emancipatory trip, right? And so they remarked that they were reading that in Boston about this history of America. This, some people like to say it's an alternate history. I said, no, this is just the history. The alternate history, we can't even get into that yet. And so she remarked about how it just changed the landscape for her, right? From one kind of tourist to another kind of tourist, celebrating and including a different legacy in this space that has so much American history and is celebrated as such, right? So they work with it, and I'm proud of them.
Good. Good. Well, again, it's that idea of transformative education, right? You shift a perspective and provide some different lenses for thinking about things that we tend to take for granted. And I really appreciate you taking time out of your evening to share your perspectives and knowledge with us, and helping us to enter into this month that we set aside to reflect on and learn about Black history, and to give us the intellectual tools to help make that reflection possible. So, Courtney Terry, thank you so much for joining us this evening, for being a part of our live stream program. And again, folks, if you're watching, please let your friends know that you can watch this program anytime on our YouTube channel. It's going to go up right the second this program ends, and it will stay there forever, at least until YouTube is no longer in existence, which probably will not be anytime soon. So please share this with your family and friends, and be sure to check out our other programs with the Black Futures Farm and also with Elizabeth McLaughlin later this month. And thank you all for joining us. Again, Courtney, thank you, and really appreciate you taking time out to chat with us tonight. So until next time, everybody,
Absolutely.
be well, and we'll see you soon.